What if someone has an NDE that's totally different from the conventional narratives? How would you interpret that?
Well, I think there are some out there like that, and from my point of view, oftentimes the exception is what helps to prove the rule.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, for example, my NDE, I was amnesic for the life of Eben Alexander before coma.
Yeah.
And that was a very important part of my journey, even though that is an atypical feature. It took me a long time to figure out how that could be. Why was I amnesic? And of course, early on, I explained it all as well. That was because I had a severe bacterial meningitis that had wiped out the human part of my brain. So of course, it would wipe out all my memories of my life before. The true answer is much deeper than that, but the reality is there are exceptions, but what became very clear to me as I read more and more of the near-death literature, and before my coma, I had never paid any attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
I knew it was out there, but I also was convinced that the brain creates consciousness, which, of course, my journey showed me is false. And because of that, I just never paid attention to near-death experiences. But when I did start reading them, beginning about 6 weeks after my own coma, after I'd written everything down about what I could remember,
Mm-hmm.
I was really amazed by the similarities, and not just of the modern, 6 decades of
Sure.
millions and millions of NDEs that have come out of medical resuscitative techniques, but also the additional NDEs and writings of mystics and prophets going back thousands of years are talking about the very same thing. And I think that's what's so striking. And if you get caught up in the details of some of the differences that are manifested, especially because our language is an earth-based language and it's not really
Mm-hmm.
very suitable to describing those kind of journeys,
Sure.
you start to realize that they're talking about the same real world. But it is so different from this world in many respects. It's so much more real in a sense, and also so much more pure in terms of being aligned with ascendants of our souls, that it is not something that lends itself easily to description using an earth-based language. And I think that's a big part of the problem. But yeah, there are differences in the stories, but from my point of view, I think that's why Map of Heaven is such a I'm very pleased with the way it's come together,
Mm-hmm.
because it really is one of consolidating those different viewpoints and cutting to the reality that's underlying them, and pointing out that heaven is absolutely real. It's part of our very existence, at the fundament of our consciousness, and that is the part that I think is so important. And the more you get into these kind of journeys, even when you encounter those occasional white crows out there that seem to be so
Sure.
outstanding and yet different from some of the others, they all give us a picture of the grander reality that is there. And I think that's the important thing. There are the hellish NDEs. I think those are, by and large, incomplete, that people don't go in with enough oomph to get to the other side. But those are really extreme minority.
Yep.
4% of all NDEs.
Yep.
The surprising thing is how similar they are when you really look at all the different medical situations that get people in that circumstance, and also when you start considering what are called shared death experiences. You may be familiar with those.
Oh, yeah.
Moody has written about them, and I have several in Map of Heaven, where souls of bystanders there at the bedside of a loved one who's passing over, their soul gets taken along on the journey too. And those stories I hear a lot about, and those completely defy any kind of simplistic medical pseudo-explanations that one might attempt to apply for NDEs, because with shared death experiences, the people are completely healthy and intact, and yet their soul is taken along on the journey.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a very good point, and you certainly had some really good examples there. By the way, a little bit different. I'm wondering about fainting, because I didn't see anything about fainting. Have you studied any literature about? Because often when people faint, they do dream. Have you studied anything about that, or?
Well, I haven't really. I think the important thing is that, all of these alterations in consciousness give us a little thumbnail sketch of another facet of consciousness, which, is the real big mystery at the core of all this.
That's right. Yeah.
Is that deep enigma of consciousness itself. And fainting, dream states, while sleeping, there are many things. I know that in the last 2 years of my going around discussing all this, I was asked to speak at a conference that was on death and dying, and the first day was on NDEs, the second day was on psychedelic drug experiences and psychedelic therapy, and how it can be used to help people get into a better mindset around the concept of physical death. And I think that, that's just another way of saying that there are many ways of looking at this phenomenon of consciousness and trying to unravel what it's all about.
Yeah, absolutely.
And fainting, dream states, psychedelic drugs.
Well, I mean, just from my personal experience, I have a phobia of needles, and every now and then, if I give blood, which is rare, I'll faint quite easily, and I'm out for 30 seconds to a minute, and I'm always dreaming during that time, which is interesting.
Right. So. That is actually a very common experience. In fact, I will tell you that a lot of people I know in medicine, doctors and nurses, tell their own story of the first time they ever, fainted from a needle stick or something like that. It's real common. People, you can get over that pretty easily if you are exposed to it a few times. But, in that kind of a state, people can get a glimpse of, other aspects of consciousness. I think the important part of my journey and of so much of the awakening of science today is that old thinking that I had that the brain creates consciousness is what is so totally misleading. Yeah. And of course that was kind of the underlying tenet in so much of our science of the 20th century is the brain creates consciousness. In fact, neuroscientists back then would say the consciousness doesn't even exist. It's just an illusion created by the physical workings of the subatomic particles, atoms, and molecules in the brain. And yet now we're coming to realize that's completely false, that the thing that really exists is consciousness, soul, spirit. And I think that's a big part of the message that I try and elaborate on in Map of Heaven. It goes beyond proof of heaven.
Yeah, well, actually, yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned Bell's theorem that proves that particles can be intertwined and communicate instantaneously, so faster than light, which illustrates that everything is one in a sense. We're all connected. Do you also believe that that's how that's related to telepathy, and also what other implications are there?
Well, I think the implications are tremendous. I mean, first of all, the big message here is that consciousness is actually freed up to a far grander level of awareness when it is set free from the shackles of the physical brain. When you realize that the brain does not create consciousness, obviously the brain is very tightly linked to consciousness, but the better way of looking at it, and I think the way a lot of modern scientists who deal with this are going, is to see the brain as a reducing valve or filter that kind of limits down pre-existing consciousness to this tiny little trickle of the apparent here and now that any one of us experiences when we're fully into this physical incarnation. And so that's an important thing to realize. Consciousness is fundamental. In fact, the science of quantum physics has been trying to tell us this for more than a century, and yet those who are hooked into pure scientific materialism in quantum physics really cannot move beyond that.
Sure.
It's called the measurement problem in quantum mechanics.
Heisenberg's uncertainty.
Separate the observer from the observed. But I think that whole entanglement phenomenon is a very important facet because to me, when you really follow it all the way down, the entire universe is entangled throughout all of eternity in a very deep and strong and powerful sense of what entanglement really is. And it's this is a way of really seeing, when you realize the fundamental nature of consciousness at the core of all that exists, and that all of our consciousness is really one, then you start to realize that things like telepathy and past life memories in children and precognition, deja vu phenomenon,
Mm-hmm.
all those things have to do with that kind of overlap of consciousness that we can begin to explore.
Yep.
And that's why I'm such a proponent of meditation, why I've been doing the research most recently with sacred acoustics, and as you know from the book Map of Heaven,
Yep.
I use those meditations. Those who are interested should go to sacredacoustics.com to learn more. But I use those meditations on a daily basis to get back
That's cool.
into those.
How many? Yeah, and at the end of the book, you do mention that. So how often do you meditate each day? Yeah.
I try and meditate an hour or two a day. I have a busy travel schedule, so I cannot always do that. But I try and meditate an hour or two a day. I will say that it was about 2 years after my coma that I started getting more deeply into meditation, and especially using sounds. As I mentioned in the book Proof of Heaven, the very generic concept is something called binaural beats. But the sacred acoustic sounds go far beyond that.
That's when you've got like the slight frequency difference between the two.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the slight difference in frequency between the two ears.
Yeah.
And
the 104 kilohertz or the
thing.
100 or something you said.
Right, exactly. The example I gave in the book is 100 hertz in one ear, 104 hertz in the other. Signal between the two, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So that is.
But you have to use headphones for that.
Yes, the headphones are the best way to isolate the signals and get the strongest effect. And we don't know. We certainly don't know exactly what is going on in those kind of circumstances. But binaural beats were something that were even used back in the early days of the psychic spy program, by various governments around the world, the Soviets, the Chinese, the Americans, British, and others who were using remote viewers. And they found that the binaural beats could engender, more readily a deep remote viewing state in some participants. So it's been known for a long time that there's something magical going on around binaural beats and consciousness.
That's really cool.
My own feeling is that the binaural beats help to release conscious awareness from the shackles of the physical brain. I think that's part of what is going on there. But things like telepathy and precognition, remote viewing, communication with departed loved ones, all that can be greatly enhanced in those using those kind of sounds like I use with sacred acoustics.
Now I'm going to have to try that. So how do you usually do it? Do you sit down? Do you lie down? You put the headphones on?
I usually lie down with the headphones on, and I get into a very deep trance with those. And it's a completely timeless region where you're not bound by the constraints of space and time that we generally sense in our kind of physical incarnation. Mm-hmm. So it's a way of getting away from that and getting into a much deeper facet of pure knowing in that consciousness.
Very cool. And then, actually, speaking of that, you mentioned that we're all here to learn, and our physical existence isn't a punishment, but rather, I quote, an unfolding of the cosmos itself. So I'm wondering, what does that imply in terms of the meaning of our lives, and where does free will come into play?
Well, that is a beautiful question. In fact, I think free will is right at the very origin of all of the interest and discussion about these issues, because our modern neuroscience would try and tell you, well, no one has free will, no one has consciousness. Those are illusions created by the physical workings of the brain. In fact, I would say that my coma journey showed me just the opposite is true. The thing that truly exists is consciousness, soul, spirit, that in fact all of this material realm exists as the stage on which the drama is to unfold for our higher spiritual beings to come down into these lower forms, these more dense energy forms of our physical incarnations. And we do that knowing full well that we will be temporarily veiled, knowing what our souls can know in those higher realms. When we you hear the near-death experiences all the time of people reuniting with their higher soul and soul mates and soul groups, and seeing that it is all about learning, that this is really soul school. I would say that the earthly realm, this material physical realm, is here so that sentient beings can learn these lessons that we learn through being on this side of the veil. An important thing to understand, obviously, is that even our higher souls on the other side of the veil do not have infinite knowledge. This is all about a learning experience. And it kind of gets back to the ideas of Teilhard de Chardin that, in fact, consciousness seems to be at the core of evolution of this universe when you look at it in the biggest way. So each and every one of us is kind of a microcosm of what's going on with the entire universe, with consciousness expanding and evolving. And it's all around these lessons, at least from an individual level, lessons of love and compassion, forgiveness and acceptance, taking care of our fellow beings. I mean, it was clear to me on my journey, as I point out in the book Proof of Heaven, that infinite deity, that undescribable, infinitely loving deity at the core of all of this existence that goes beyond naming, who many would call God, that deity loves Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, skeptics. That God loves all. So this is very much about taking down those false boundaries of separation that can be so confusing.
Sure. Yeah, you mentioned, I think, about different climbers on a mountain that might have different religions or point of views, but at the end, when you get to the peak, it's all the same, right?
I think that became very clear to me, too, because I'd never really paid much attention to the various religions before. I'd grown up in a Christian environment, going to a Methodist church growing up, and then married and continued to go to an Episcopal church after that. So I really didn't have a real broad-based view of different religions. But after I started giving my talks, I was contacted by more and more people from the deeper mystical traditions, say, for example, by Sufis, Islamic mystics, by Christian mystics, by Buddhists, long-term transcendental meditators, et cetera, across the board. It became clear to me that the mystical traditions of all those great religions converge on that same one knowing of the deeper nature of reality and of that deity at the core. It's the dogma at the edges of the religions, especially any dogma that tends to pit us against each other, that is false and misleading. So it's just a deeper understanding of how our little defining brain, our linguistic brain, sets up all these false boundaries and limits. And that's one thing that through meditation, because meditation at its first level involves taking that little voice in my head, letting that little voice make a statement or a request, but then that little voice goes into timeout, because there is far greater wisdom within consciousness that we can get to through meditation. And it is something that transcends that linguistic bottleneck that we suffer through in these physical incarnations and trying to make sense of things. Sure. That's why it's a strong proponent for people to meditate. That's how you're really going to get into these deeper answers. You can't just read about it and go to lectures about it and watch DVDs. You've really got to go there yourself.
You got to be ready. You got to jump in. Absolutely.
You got it.
Yeah, and by the way, I want to compliment you also. I love the fact that the book draws from so many different sources. As you mentioned, you've got mystics of all different types of cultures and periods, and it's very impressive. To see things from, I don't know, you saying like that Adam comes from Earth and in Hebrew, and learning that even the word ceiling comes from cielo. I felt like I learned all these really cool things as I read it. So that was really fun.
I think, again, that gets us back to that same point I made a minute ago, that our linguistic brain, to define is to limit, as Descartes said, and that's what our little linguistic brain does, is it sets up all these definitions and limits and compartmentalizes everything as if that's going to give us the answer. The same problem exists in our modern science. Our modern science, which the conventional form is something called reductive materialism, which basically means if you reduce everything down to the subatomic particles and then you understand the laws that govern the working of those subatomic particles and build up into atoms and molecules and cells and all of that, then you can explain everything. The reality is we lose a lot of information by tearing it all down into the basic constituents.
Sure.
And so I prefer a more top-down view of getting to reality, and that's where the meditation is so handy, because by getting into higher and higher spiritual levels, even out to that core realm, and then looking back at it all, it can make so much more sense. And that's what a lot of this is about, is trying to get rid of the problems in our thinking that come from reductive materialism, reducing things down to the lowest, the least common elements,
Yep.
then trying to understand it all. We lose a lot of information. And that is one of the problems with our modern science, although I think our modern science can be adapted and be very useful at going after some of these deeper and more powerful questions.
You mentioned Bell's theorem, which basically, that's a great tool that you get from modern science. So you do have, right, it can go both ways, right?
Right, exactly. And I think I often say in my talks that spirituality and science strengthen each other tremendously. Mm-hmm. And I believe that's absolutely true. And again, it's an issue here of rising above those false boundaries of separation and realize that the commonalities within these fields of study and within these stories and within these observations and these various analytical systems, it's the synthesis of it all that then starts to make far more sense. And that's kind of the approach that I started with in Proof of Heaven, and I think I've taken to the next level in Map of Heaven to try and make sense of this. But you really have to take away those false boundaries that kind of strip us down to a very limited view, and you have to take a viewpoint that involves, thousands of years of kind of human evolution and the many billions of years of evolution in the cosmos, and step outside to where you can really see the higher dimensions, see the much broader picture here, and it starts to then make more sense and come together. And that's what I try and do in Map of Heaven.
Sure. Now you mentioned, the book Flat World, and how, it's really about different dimensions. If somebody from a two-dimensional world goes to a three-dimensional world, it's hard for him to explain what he saw. Same thing you're saying here as well. If you have...
It's very true. I think, and, that's why I love giving talks to an audience that, say, has 70 or 80% of the people in there have had near-death experiences, because the communication often far transcends the words that are being used. Mm-hmm. And, of course, with an audience of many who have been there in this incarnation and come back, to share their stories, yes, that's a very powerful experience. But in reality, all of our souls have been there and go there many, many times. And I think that's one of the reasons why the book Proof of Heaven resonated so strongly and had such an appeal globally. I mean, it's in publication in 43 countries now, and
oh yeah, no, it's had a huge impact.
All of the commonality that this story has for all of us, yep. And a reminder of our souls of something that is at the fundament of all reality. And I think that's what this is all about. We're not trying to learn and teach as much as recover and remember. Yeah. And that's what this kind of thing is all about. That's what Map of Heaven is about, is helping souls to remember a deeper truth that is buried within each and every one of us and buried within all cultures. It's really independent of culture, but they get covered up in different ways by the various cultures and languages.
Sure. By the way, I also, a very interesting point that you mentioned about contemporary culture is that it's obsessed with youth, and that we've forgotten the ancient wisdom that growth never stops. Could you further explain that?
Well, I think this is all about growing and learning. And when I say that, I mean the grander picture of what I present here about the eternity of our souls. Because, again, something I didn't stress so much in Proof of Heaven, but I brought out there was an anniversary edition of Proof of Heaven where I got much more deeply into reincarnation in an afterword, and then also discuss reincarnation, the importance of it in Map of Heaven. But this is always about learning, and that's what our souls are doing. Our souls are here to teach and learn within our soul groups. In fact, I I also often say that the best way to make sense of this in the spirit of kind of standing back and looking at the bigger picture is not to look at the individual soul in multiple incarnations, but really look at the soul group and the interactions of a soul group. And by soul group, I mean it can be very broad. And your soulmate may not be that spouse with whom you were in deep love. It could also be the spouse with whom you had a bitter divorce or something like that. I came to realize that many who I had seen before my coma as my nemesis were in fact very near and dear soulmates. And we were trying to learn and teach very difficult lessons. I think that's an important thing to understand about all this is very much a process of growth. We never stop learning. In fact, the whole universe never stops evolving and learning in that grander sense. And so that's what this is really all about. And nothing is more important in all of this than our love and compassion for others and forgiveness and acceptance and being there for others. It's the relationships. That's the only thing that has any kind of cachet in that realm. The love that we've shown, passing out the unconditional love of the Creator for others in this creation, that's how we reap the benefits of that love. And it has tremendous power to heal. That's why it's so important. And each and every one of us, as individuals, as soul groups, as humanity, as life on earth, and as consciousness beyond the bounds of the earth, is in the process of healing with our being in these incarnate forms. This is all part of that growth and healing. So that's really what it's all about, is growth, learning, and healing.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I've got another question. What are you thinking about, I guess, for the next few years? What obviously you've had a huge impact already. What are your, what would you like to do? Would you like to write another book? Obviously
I will tell you, I am on a vertical part of the learning curve. I'm still, people who have studied near-death experiences for decades will tell you it takes a long, long, long time to process a near-death experience. What I will tell you is it takes many lifetimes, essentially, to process a near-death experience. I don't expect to have all the answers at all in this incarnation, although I love the journey of getting deeper into the answers. So it's really always about learning. I'm in a steady learning environment from now until the end of my days in this incarnation, then on into the next one. You had mentioned free will before, and I do believe I've had a book idea for a while here that will address that whole issue of free will and, kind of in juxtaposition to a divine plan, because I think both are active. I think that there's a tremendous amount of kind of bigger plan to all of this going on in our lives and in the kind of destiny, the arc of destiny of humanity. And that is very much where so much of this is going, is that kind of deeper learning and coming to an understanding, and especially about free will, because I believe that free will and our manifestation of the proper free will choices to allow our ascendance as soul groups into the higher and higher levels to become one with the divine, that's really what this is so much about. And I can't say that book is fully fleshed out in my mind, but the book that addresses free will and discusses it in terms of that divine plan, I think is a natural follow-on in terms of where I'm going. I love giving talks about this. For me, and as Map of Heaven clearly demonstrates, I hope, I came to realize with the many people who would come up and talk to me after every presentation I made and share stories they'd never shared with anyone else, any one of which might change this world. I came to realize that's how the world really changes, is through the millions and millions of amazing stories out there from journeyers who have had near-death experiences, after-death communications, past life memories in children, showing reincarnation, all these tremendous spiritually transformative experiences. That is what is changing this world. And Proof of Heaven is just one little story among so many fantastic and amazing stories out there.
Sure.
And that's why I never tire of going out and sharing my story, But really what I get out of that is hearing other people's stories, because they bolster the power of my understanding of this tremendously.
Yep.
And really, I see the biggest kind of question in the future of the history of science. They're going to look back on this age of this 20th century and early 21st century and wonder why it took us so long to figure out that the deep mystery of consciousness was a clue about the richest and most powerful understanding of the nature of existence that is fully in alignment with some of the deepest spiritual traditions going back thousands of years, about the reality of that God and of our eternal spiritual beings. And the future historians of science will just wonder, why was it took them so long after discovering the mysteries within quantum mechanics, it took them so long to figure out what was going on in terms of consciousness and what it was telling us about the nature of all existence.
Yeah. I believe, by the way, because I did study physics in undergrad, that in terms of free will and quantum mechanics, that if you do believe, and the one could basically, the solution to free will, because obviously you have to eliminate the idea that everything's random or that everything's completely determined, then what you do is you basically, if you believe that there's a soul that's partially transcendental, you can have an epiphenomenon where every once in a while the soul could influence the outcome of something that's quantumly mechanically random, and that way, as long as it's every now and then a couple of decisions are made, overall it wouldn't change the statistics quantum mechanically, but it would be enough to actually exert decision making and influence. So I don't think
that's very much the case. I mean, when I came back from my journey, I realized I had to question everything I'd ever thought I knew about the nature of reality. Everything had to be put in question. And that is, I think, what you have to do if you're going to address those deep mysteries within quantum mechanics and trying to get to any kind of an answer. We have to throw everything out that we thought we knew. But the important thing is that when you put consciousness in that fundamental role of really driving the bus and determining everything that unfolds in our observed reality, it starts to make much more sense. And I think any model of the nature of reality has to much better address that role of consciousness in its fundamental role in everything. Mm-hmm. And I think that you certainly bring up a wonderful point, and I'd like to steer you to a book that is right along those lines. It's called The Soul Hypothesis. It's in my, if you go to EbenAlexander.com, it's in the reading list there. It's by Baker and Getz. They were the editors. But it's a very good book, and there's a chapter 6 in there by Hans Halvorsen, all about quantum mechanics and how it opens the door for several potential powerful explanations of how soul might influence physical reality.
Cool.
So that's really where science is going now, is getting deeper into those kind of questions. But the leading scientists, from my point of view in all of this, fully realize that soul consciousness is at the core of unfolding reality, and you have to understand that relationship of soul and mind and kind of conscious awareness, the relationship of that to this thing we call reality, mm-hmm. To get a fuller understanding of the nature of existence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love also, the fact that you're also bringing people's attention back to something that we've forgotten to think about. I think that having some spirituality, certainly it strengthens our existence regardless. And I think it's long overdue to have someone who tries to combine both science and spirituality in the way that you're doing.
Well, I in the book, Proof of Heaven, I make a big deal of Irreducible Mind, that book from the Division of Perceptual Studies at University of Virginia that came out in 2007. It's called Irreducible Mind Toward a Psychology for the 21st Century. 800 pages of dense scientific data and analysis about non-local consciousness, about all that we're talking about. That group is now just about done with their follow-up edition to that book. That'll come out in December of 2014. And that book, I don't know the exact title, but it's something like Science-Based Spirituality, Why We Must Abandon Physicalism. Mm-hmm. And it's really all about the same thing, how the science is really leading us to realize the power and the truth behind the spiritual teachings. And in some very unusual ways, the science brings something very powerful to the mixture, because our modern science, with things like string theory and quantum gravity, trying to put quantum physics and relativity together into a unified physics, really goes a long way towards showing that there's no material to the material world. It's vibrating strings of energy in higher dimensional space-time, or whatever you want to say, but it's not the mass and the inertia and the space and all that we see before us. Those are all kind of emergent pieces of it. Even time is an emergent part of that reality. And I think it's this deeper understanding of material science that helps also to take the spirituality to the next level by showing that nothing in this material world is important beyond the fact that it has to do with ascendance of our souls in that spiritual realm. This is set up as the stage on which that drama unfolds, and that's its utility. That's why it's important. And I think that's a beautiful, deeper understanding of it all.
Beautiful. Yeah. We'll definitely, I think that's a great reference. I'll definitely check that out as well. Speaking of time, usually it seems like a lot of these different states of awareness, they do seem to transcend time, but and bring you to other places. But do you also see them necessarily giving someone the ability to kind of go into the future as well?
I think that's very much the case. And again, that takes us right into the core of that question you put out there a little while ago about free will, and how I said I'm very interested in free will and divine plan, because if you're talking about going into the future, the superficial assumption there is, it's all predetermined. Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, I would say no. There's a divine plan that is kind of the ideal pathway towards the divine of our ascending soul groups. But there is also that free will that we manifest in the choices we make in this world. And it's the dance between those two that's so interesting. But I would say even the past is not written in stone. And that is a big part when you get deeply into quantum mechanics and where it's trying to go, how we know what we know today. Into the epistemology of how we get into an understanding of reality, there are some very deep questions about the flow of time. Einstein said past, present, and future are cleverly wrought illusions. So he knew about this even back there in the 40s and 50s. And I think that's where our modern science is going, as part of trying to address that quantum enigma and put together quantum gravity and string theory, is this idea that past and future are kind of symmetrical in a much deeper sense than we might realize in our everyday lives. And, it's that symmetry that is so interesting. And I think it's always been fascinating to physicists that there seems to be no directional arrow of time within physics equations. The mathematics of physics can flow both ways. And yet our real physical reality seems to flow, at least in the macro level.
The only thing supposedly is entropy, which is a statistical
right. The second law of thermodynamics is a statistical approach, but when you get down to the quantum level, it's not telling you that past flows into future. At the quantum level, it seems to flow in loops. But anyway, the upshot of all that is in getting to a deeper understanding of time and of what time is and of all the other aspects of how we know things. I know this may be sounding a bit obtuse, but that's why I gave the two references that I gave on my website, EbenAlexander.com. There's something about my message to the neurological community, and the references 5 and 6 there in that paper that I wrote are in the American Institute of Physics, two conferences in the physics community in San Diego, one in 2006, one in 2011, all about the frontiers of time, retrocausation, the deep mysteries when you get into the physics of time flow and an understanding of quantum phenomena that show us that it's nowhere near as simple as past, present, future when you get down into that deeper level. And I think that is part of understanding how all this is put together.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Time flow in that realm is completely different and makes much more sense than time flow in this level. And I think to put that in perspective, I would simply point out that when people go through life reviews in a near-death experience,
Hmm.
the events of their life are presented to them in extremely real fashion, much more real than when they lived through it here. And they can sometimes seem a little random when people come back and talk about it. And yet in that realm, that life review is a very solid and ordered, not necessarily chronologically ordered, but ordered review of life events about good and bad that still have to do with residual lessons that we're to learn before the next incarnation. Those life reviews are a very important window into the nature of the reality of time and how things are truly thrown together in our kind of lifetime flow of events versus in a life review, where they're presented in a much more real fashion and also in a way that we are often take on the identity of souls around us impacted by our decisions. So we feel the emotional power that our choices
Hmm.
had on those souls around us. And that's part of the lessons that we're to learn before the next incarnation. It's a deeper way of understanding time flow and causality.
Sure. Yeah, I love that. And yeah, no, that's great. Wow, we've covered a lot of turf. So I don't know. Before we sign off, any other key points you'd like to mention?
Well, I think in all of this kind of scientific and philosophical discussion, one point that is fundamentally most important tends to get lost,
Hmm.
and that's for souls to remember that they are deeply loved and cherished forever, and that by knowing that bottomless uh, ocean of beautiful, unconditional love and feeling that we are each the divine recipient of that divine creative source, that is what gives us the power to be fearless. And of course, that's kind of the central message in Proof of Heaven, but it's one that I hope I expound on a bit there in Map of Heaven to help souls remember that's what this is all about, that we are all infinitely capable creatures as part of that divine oneness of consciousness. And this is really all about love, compassion, forgiveness. And those things can cure all the ills of this world. And they are in the process of doing that through this global awakening that's coming now.
And do you think that yes, you believe that heaven indeed will manifest itself on this earth eventually?
I believe that's where we're all headed, yes. And it's by manifesting that love and that forgiveness and that compassion and that acceptance and that mercy that we will bring it to this world.
Yeah, amen. That's I can definitely say that. Well, I mean,
It's
in
something to do, that's for sure.
in terms of civilization, though, every now and then even though you see an increase of knowledge, we seem to often forget things that we've learned and go back to I guess primitive or extremely violent courses. How yeah, I mean, what would you tell the skeptic who tells you that the world isn't necessarily getting any better, but mentioning that it might be getting worse.
I often say it's kind of like cracking the egg shell to make the omelet. Uh, and that in fact, it would surprise me if the world weren't now at a point where we've almost painted ourselves into a corner where we have only one choice, and that's either to awaken to this reality or to go extinct as an entire species and possibly as a planet,
Hmm.
if we are, that unwise as to destroy ourselves, which everyone knows we can do. We've proven that ability. It's kind of the ugly underbelly of all those successes of science and technology of the 20th century, is that unbridling that you mentioned, modern warfare, thoughtless homicide and suicide, polarization of economic resources, and destruction of our ecology
Yep.
is all part of the darker side of that unbridled science when it was separated from spirit, from human consciousness, spirit, and the divine. And that's what is going to happen here with this awakening that I believe is upon this world now, is a reuniting of our spirit self with that scientific wisdom to help take us to an unprecedented level. But to me, it's no surprise at all that things appear to be getting worse, because that is what I expect before the next phase, which is of our grand awakening, which we're entering even now.